thank you for making me sound so great. I appreciate it. And thank you for all the introduction. I'm relieved to say that what I'm going to say is very in tune with what we've heard from Deb and Robert, so that's a good place to start. You may well be wondering, since you've probably gathered that I'm an engineer by profession, what I'm doing on a platform talking about the future of work. I would normally be on a platform talking about an emerging technology like virtual reality or 5G, so I'm a bit out of my comfort zone. But the reason I'm here is because technology and engineering is impacting the economy, the workplace, and very much people. So I'm addressing these issues because I think we increasingly need multidisciplinary teams in a hyper-connected world looking at these issues all together. So I'm ready to play my part in that. So Deb told you about my career. I've been at companies like the BBC and Sony, both in the Europe and in the US as well. But I first got drawn into the subject of work when I was invited to join the Independent Commission on the Future of Work a few years ago. And I was one of a couple of engineers in a multidisciplinary team, which was great. Had economists, lawyers, academics, trade unions, politicians. There were some lords in the group and so on. But once that commission had reported, a few of the commissioners felt there was still more to be done. And so I joined forces with one of my co-commissioners, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist. I trust you're impressed. And Sir Chris Pissarati is his name. And we now jointly chair the Institute for the Future of Work, which I'm going to call IFOW going on because it's a bit of a mouthful. And that was founded and is now directed by Anna Thomas, who is in the second row at the front here. And one of our trustees is Graham Nuttall, who is in the second row over there. You probably know Graham Nuttall from the Nuttall Review as a very strong advocate for employee ownership. So this is my co-chair, Sir Chris. He says that a country's economy is basically meant to serve the needs of society, and we think that work is a significant societal need, so the economy needs to provide work. But Deb said it really well, as well as needing a source of income, people get a sense of purpose and well-being and even identity from their work. So we think that it's really important that the work created by the economy is good work. Now, happily, I'm pretty sure that this audience is sharing that aim of good work. Employee ownership seems to me to be part and parcel of that. Now, at the Institute, we're convinced that the changes in work over the next decade or two do present an opportunity to improve economies, businesses, and lives. So the potential to make things better and fairer does feel like something worth fighting for. So that's why I'm here anyway. So today I am going to give you a quick rundown of the tech trends that are influencing the future of work. Then I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that those bring up. And then I'll follow it with some practical stories about what we need to do to bring about human-centred technology implementation to make work better and fairer in the future. So I'll kick off by talking about some of the tech trends. And I thought I would just start by reminding you what the industrial revolutions have been. So the first industrial revolution, I'm sure you all know, was triggered by the invention of the steam engine, and that allowed manufacturing on an industrial scale in factories. The second industrial revolution was a kind of step change to mass production in factories, meaning sort of standardization across factories. And that was when steel, oil, and very importantly, electricity and the internal combustion engine came onto the scene. Then the third industrial revolution was different again. That was the move to digital. So that was the invention of the semiconductor, the PC, and the internet. And then the fourth industrial revolution is also digital, but the emergence of artificial intelligence, AI, and the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things is where things are connected to the Internet. So things like those smart speakers that you talk to are connected to the Internet. Things like your connected home thermostat or your Fitbit is probably connected to the Internet. There are industrial things like the tags in a cow's ear these days are quite often connected to the Internet. The blades of a wind turbine, a prosthetic limb will quite often be connected, as well as some implants actually inside the body. So thanks to AI and the Internet of Things, digital technology and the physical and even the biological worlds are becoming increasingly integrated. And that's a real step change. The way that we interact with technology is now very much part of the way that we live and work. So that qualifies as another industrial revolution, the fourth industrial revolution. And it is less well known, but just recently a few groups have started talking about Industry 5.0 or Work 5.0. And actually it's a similar kind of idea, but the idea is, the fourth industrial revolution is the integration of digital, physical and biological. But actually Industry or Work 5.0 is the idea that instead of focusing on that integration, actually it's focusing more on positive collaboration between man and machine to create a more inclusive and human-centred future. So it's sort of subtly different. So Deb mentioned some dystopian headlines that she'd found. There are lots of those kinds of headlines around about a future where the machines have taken over and there's no more work left. But the general consensus actually, and there is beginning to be one, of the recent research is that it looks like somewhere between 10 and 30% of jobs are going to be displaced or just change significantly in the next decade or so. And that probably there will be enough work to go around because new tasks are emerging all the time. And for example, some of the most in-demand occupations right now, today, barely existed 10 years ago. So things like app developer, social media manager, user experience manager, big data analyst. These are all jobs that were very minority 10 years ago. So there are new tasks and jobs emerging. Here's a quick trawl of jobs that are out there being talked about on the net for the future. Also, there will be loads of jobs that we can't even imagine at the moment. People who are particularly affected right now by job displacement are what's often referred to as low-skilled workers, including retail, transport and factory workers. So back in the 50s, manufacturing accounted for about 40% of jobs in the UK. Now it's down to lower than 10% of jobs. And since this is the year of Brexit, it's worth highlighting that some recent global research suggests that reshoring, i.e. bringing back jobs from overseas to the country, reshoring is linked to increasing automation. So we may well see increased job displacement in the UK through that. Hopefully, of course, in those automated factories, we will also see some higher skilled jobs emerging. Outside of London, which has its own trends, jobs in retail are declining both in numbers but also in quality, and that's seen most visibly in the decline of the high street where our shopping habits are moving online. And then in offices, we're seeing both automation and AI taking over some work, and that's happening not just for the so-called low-skill workers, but also for professional tasks. So whether you're a driver or a business person, this is affecting absolutely all of us. So if I talk about the next tech trend, talking about automation and AI, I don't want to get too hung up on the definitions, but briefly, automation is most easily understood as the creation and application of technology to perform or support predictable and repetitive tasks. So something like repeatedly picking one product off a production line and putting it somewhere else. That can be automated, as you see here. It's a sophisticated machine, but it is fundamentally dumb. This machine is not learning, it's not adapting, it's just following a script. So on the whole, when a worker's task can be automated like this, it tells you that it's a really dull, a routine task. So it's the sort of task we should be celebrating the loss of. People could just switch off their brain, it's mind-numbing. And so actually, as long as we can find something more stimulating for people to do, hurrah, if we can get a machine to do it. I should say, though, that automation isn't just about these visible tasks. It also, it covers augmenting human activities and creating new ones, and it can do that for anything repetitive and predictable. So actually, in some of our recent, not yet published research about retail sectors, what we found is that the most significant changes to work have come behind the scenes from data systems that are automating management and monitoring functions, rather than what Robert was talking about, which is the displacement, the visible displacement of cashiers. Actually, there's even more displacement going on that you're not seeing from data automation. Now, at the Institute, for traditionally run companies rather than employee-owned, we encourage management to ask their employees which tasks they would cheerfully give over to a machine instead of just figuring out what you can automate quickly and then just leaving the rest for the humans. I'm pretty confident that employee-owned companies would approach that in a rather better way. And there's research from Goldsmiths University that shows that organisations where people are positively assisted by technology rather than just replaced by it are 31% more productive. So if you do bring in technology with the intention of helping workers and making their jobs better, your employees are likely to be 1/3 more productive. So that seems like a pretty good formula to me. Now, moving on to artificial intelligence, that is defined as the art or science of using a non-human system to learn and imitate human intelligent behaviour. So that's quite different from automation. And that comes in several forms. There's narrow AI, where AI can figure things out for itself, but in a very specific area. So, for example, the AI that's running your driverless car in the future will be learning and adapting to new things on its own, but it's not going to work out how to compose music, for example. Or the AI that's deciding insurance premiums is unlikely to beat you at chess. They're good at doing something and learning and adapting, but in a specific area. And all of the AI that's in use at the moment is that kind of narrow AI. The holy grail of AI is general AI, and when we get that, it will be more like a baby's brain, that learns to speak, to understand humour, to recognise emotions, to sing, to make jokes, and continues to learn new things as it needs them throughout its life. And we are really, really long way from achieving that. Now, the sorts of things that are using AI right now include, at the simple level, things like Google search, which uses AI to figure out what it is you really want when you mistype some sort of dubious search term. It's quite good at figuring out what it is that you really wanted. And then some of those voice recognition things like Google Translate, Siri, Alexa, those smart speakers, those are using AI to understand not just what words you've said, but to figure out what it is that you really meant when you said them. And what kind of blows my mind about those is that those are just learning all the time. They're just going to get better and better. They're continuously understanding more. Now, when your bank calls you, for example, to say it's detected some fraud on your account, that will be AI in the background that's been trawling, looking for unusual patterns. Insurance companies use AI to figure out premiums. And there's a lot of uses for AI in healthcare. You may well have read recently there was a story about how AI was outperforming, on average, humans at detecting breast cancer. And in a recent survey of 900 healthcare professionals, the vast majority of them said that they thought AI represented the extension, not the extinction, of professionals in healthcare, which I rather liked. And they found actually that it was when you combined the two, when you had AI and humans together, that performed better than either AI or humans on their own. And they also found, incidentally, that the more they deployed AI, the less time that doctors were spending at their computers, which has got to be a good thing. So whether it's automation or AI, or both, the emerging thought is that these technologies are more often working alongside workers than fully replacing them. And so, as I said earlier, the trick is to automate the bits that we don't enjoy, to free us up to do things that are more fulfilling and add more value for the company, like the example of doctors spending less time at their computers and more time with patients. And if you remember one thing from today, please remember this, that actually this dystopian future that's not right. It's not about displacement. It's not about jobs disappearing. It's about humans and machines finding ways of working together that are better than what we have today. So it's about both. It's not an either or. So another technology that's impacting work is online platforms. So thanks to ubiquitous digital technology, we've got international digital platforms, things like Amazon, Uber, Deliveroo, or Fiverr, and those can offer access to work in a different way to gig workers. And gig workers really are sort of just taking on one project at a time. So Fiverr, if you haven't heard of it, that's here. It's a website where businesses can post relatively highly skilled tasks, so things like digital marketing, programming, graphic design, and then workers can pick up a task and get paid for it. you can actually find a platform offering the sort of work you're looking for. There's a whole range of them, from very highly skilled, very niche occupations down to the so-called low-skilled workers like cleaners or drivers. One of the issues with platforms like this, though, is that although the flexibility of being able to choose your own work schedule can be really fantastic for some people, if you're trying to make a full-time living this way, it can be really insecure, and there are very few workers' rights or protections that go with it. But talking of gig workers, I was reading an article the other day about how half as many teenagers have Saturday jobs today as did in the 90s. And I thought it was really interesting, and that's because they're online. Quite often they're trading. They might be buying and selling fashion, for example, online. They might be picking up these gig work jobs, but they're not doing their shift in Sainsbury's. And I think that's quite interesting socially. I think that's quite a shift. So that does bring me to the changing nature of careers, thanks to all of this tech. So the trend is much less for one career at one employer over a lifetime. And it's even moved beyond what I've done, which is one career but across multiple employers over a lifetime. It is now much more normal to have quite a few careers on the go at once with multiple companies all at the same time. And companies are beginning to organise themselves around projects so that they can make use of this kind of ad hoc workforce. And so I've kind of scratched my head a bit on this one over the employee ownership model, because I know that you tend to generate a lot of employee loyalty and longevity, and I haven't quite figured out yet what this trend for kind of portfolio employment is likely to mean in the context of employee ownership. But what I do know is that some big companies in the UK have responded to that by offering much more flexible contracts. So, for example, I was talking to PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, and they said they now offer 3 types of contracts to any new recruit. You can have a permanent full-time contract, you can have a permanent part-time contract, or you can have a permanent full-time contract for just 3 months a year. And then the other 9 months you shove off, you do something else, whatever, travel, charity, and then you come back and you do another 3 months, and then you shove off again. And they said they are offering that flexibility because people are asking for it. And they also mentioned that those younger recruits are expecting to be working with technology. They're looking for automation and technology to be assisting them, and that they want to work for a company with clear mission and a sense of values and purpose. And I think that's kind of, we're seeing that actually with some of the bigger players like Google or Amazon, where their employees have begun to take collective action over things like, a defence contract that they didn't feel fitted with the company's values, or lack of climate action, or employee rights. And so I think that's an interesting trend that we're beginning to see that, and I shall hold my breath and see where that goes. And as Deb mentioned, I'm on the board of a couple of listed companies, and I have noticed a bit of a shift even there, where I'm guessing it's driven by pressure from an increasing number of ethical investors who are demanding a much higher standard of more sustainable behaviour from companies rather than only looking for the profits. And in that same vein, I saw on the Davos Manifesto of 2020, it was explaining how organisations should establish and track their progress towards environmental, social and governance goals, as well as doing the standard financial metrics. So I think that's a really good step. It's becoming much more mainstream. At IFOW, we certainly argue that we should explicitly embed thinking about good local jobs and good work as part of those sustainability goals. So all of those technology trends that I've described, they have got this potential to be a fantastic leveller. You could give everyone on this planet access to all the world's knowledge. How incredible. You could say that anyone with an internet connection has the potential to be able to get work. People with disabilities can have all sorts of support to help them to engage fully within society and in the workplace. But despite all of those really positive opportunities, the threat right now is that we're seeing investors, innovators and shareholders mostly benefiting from this, especially the platform tech. So on the whole, the tech owners are getting richer, and only the really highly skilled workers are getting a share of that. So it's technology plus globalization that's driving that changing economic model. But one of the things that cheers me up about that is that we worry today about companies like Amazon and Google and how they've got this kind of stranglehold. It's just hard to see how those can ever be shifted or competed with. And there's a few individuals at those companies just getting obscenely rich, while the workers definitely not seeing their share of that. But I will remind you that 20 years ago, we used to kind of say the same things about IBM, about Microsoft, AOL, remember them? And Nokia. We said the same thing. So actually, I do think that we don't have to accept the fact that we're going to have this inequality. I do think change is possible. And frankly, I'm sure you can see how employee ownership, or at least more ethical management practices in traditional firms, is definitely needed to mitigate that emerging inequality. But it's worth saying at the Institute, we absolutely think that AI, automation, and these new online platforms are a route to improving work, increasing productivity, and boosting the economy. So we're pro. We think it's really important, though, that companies do invest in the tech. And I know that's not always easy for SMEs to do. But the Bank of England says that they think it is that lack of investment in technology that's key to the UK's poor productivity overall. But if we are going to embrace that new tech, it's important that it's done in a way that centres around the human workforce. And it would also be positive if we could find a way of sharing that investment more broadly across the whole workforce. But those are things that employee ownership delivers, as I understand it. So if we can create workplaces where human jobs and productivity are enhanced and supported by technology, then we will have made that industry or work 5.0 a reality. So that's the kind of tech introduction. Those are the techs that are impacting work. I said I'd talk about some of the challenges around the future of work, so I'm going to talk a little bit about skills and then follow it up with ethics and fairness before I move on to what we can do to support the creation of good work. So this is the list of skills from the World Economic Forum that they think will be more valuable in the future. And they're things basically that they think will be hard to replace with machines. But according to the World Economic Forum, they say that 65% of children entering primary school today will end up in jobs that don't exist yet. So we can't teach those children the skills that they need because we don't know what they are, but we can teach them to be adaptable, and the same is true for adults as well as kids. So the opportunity to continuously learn new things, I mean, that can be really motivating for some people, but there was some recent OECD research that found that in the UK, more than 40% of people said that they didn't want any further training. They just wanted to keep doing what they're doing today. And frankly, I just don't think that's going to be possible. IFOW surveys with Opinium echo that research. They show that it's those workers who most need training that aren't aware of the risks and are not receiving any. And also a recent IFOW index on labour market resilience highlighted some kind of bigger picture challenges with the extent of insecure or atypical work in the UK being much bigger than in EU comparator countries. So our analysis suggests that this prevalence of insecure work, particularly in the UK, is linked to things that we're not so good at. Well, you're good at this stuff. Things like vocational training, the lack of that makes us worse in the UK than the rest of Europe. But I would hope that employee-owned organisations would be much better at that than the average employer. So we do need to find things to do to support those people most at risk. Good news is that the research we're working on at the moment finds qualitative evidence that indicates employees in employee-owned organisations feel more empowered to adopt changes to their roles. So the implication of that is that employee-owned businesses are better able to change roles and upskill employees than traditional businesses. So actually, you should have an innovation advantage, it seems to me. So moving on to ethics and fairness, all of this technology and automation does mean that some huge companies are able to make vast profits whilst treating their low-skilled workforce rather poorly. And I talked to an Amazon delivery driver recently, and he told me about his job delivering parcels. And it's not a well-paid job, but actually that was not his complaint. His main issue was the way that he is managed, which is by an app on his phone that is really prescriptive. It tells him exactly what order to deliver things in, which route to take, even tells him how many seconds he's allowed to spend on each doorstep. And if he doesn't obey the app, he gets into all sorts of trouble with his management. And yet sometimes he'll know something that the app doesn't know. He'll know that the business is closed for a special event and there's no one there, but he has to go there anyway. And he says it's just awful. He feels like a human robot. He feels like an automaton. He switches his brain off, leaves it at home, and it's soul-destroying work. And it's disappointing. Amazon could do better because there are companies that use that sort of technology, but they just leave a little bit of autonomy with the drivers, and it makes the most enormous difference to job satisfaction and well-being. And we are seeing similar issues with companies using AI and monitoring software. You may have seen last week there was a story about Barclays Bank where employee movements and even every keystroke were being monitored. And there could be all sorts of really positive reasons for doing that, but it can have a very negative impact on employees. So it's really important to be considered about how that kind of technology is implemented and make sure the employees understand its purpose. Another angle on AI and ethics in the workplace is fairness. So theoretically, you'd think that a machine could rise above sexism, racism, all forms of discrimination, but I'm sure you really know already that there are lots of examples where AI has accidentally learnt our own biases from the data that we feed it. And at IFOW, we just published 3 AI case studies, and they use real-life examples but compiled as hypothetical examples, and that includes using AI for hiring, performance management, and targeted job advertising. And in all cases, despite the very best intentions, the outputs of these activities became increasingly biased over time, and they gave less favourable treatment to women and ethnic minorities. And that's effectively automated discrimination. I guess the thing that worried me most was that in these case studies, that despite identifying the potential biases there, a lot of the companies just pressed ahead with the automation anyway. Now, I mentioned earlier that AI is in routine use. It's in banking, insurance, healthcare, education, as well as the criminal justice system. You probably heard in London that the Met Police is introducing face recognition, which uses AI. And we know that many of these systems are producing biased results. So it is something I think we should all be concerned about. However, there are things that we can do, and at IFOW, we've established an equality task force to work on those issues. And there's a couple of things we're campaigning for. One of them, we're working with the UK government looking at having another look at effectively equal rights and the Data Protection Acts in this particular context, because we've actually got quite a lot of legislation already. We're just not applying it in the right context. So we want to make sure we make use of the existing legal framework for starters. And then we're also arguing for something around algorithmic fairness legislation, which is a kind of right-to-know legislation. And although it's tricky to figure out how to implement it, the idea is that you broadly should have the right to know roughly how a machine made an important decision about you. And there are other countries that are bringing in similar legislation, so I do think we will inevitably get that. And I would add on a positive note that recent research suggests that organisations which operate workplace democracy, which I would include employee-owned organisations as, those organisations are more likely to respect human rights and equality responsibilities. And if you look at it specifically in relation to data, it's also been found that cooperatives show higher levels of corporate responsibility. So, for example, the US emerging data co-ops, for example, for medical data or farming data, have been built on privacy and transparency, whereas their competitors are built on surveillance and central control. And in the UK, Equal Care, a social care cooperative, is setting up along similar lines, sort of maximising flexibility and autonomy both for the workers and the patients. So that feels like a good step. So to understand a bit more about how employee ownership sits with the future of work, I spoke to Chris Newenham, who's the joint MD of Wilkin Sons, who are the makers of Tiptree Jam. I'm a big fan, by the way, of the product. They're a business that has been employee-owned for about 30 years, and over that time they've gone from an annual turnover of about 6 million and 189 full-time employees to more than 48 million and 570 full-time employees. But Chris pointed out to me that actually that's 8 times the revenue and only 3 times the staff. So you can see that they've dramatically increased their productivity over that time. And when they do bring in new technology, it does sometimes mean a reduction in workers in one area, but then other developments might result in more staff being needed elsewhere. But they have needed to continuously innovate and bring new products and new businesses to stay ahead of the competition. And the kinds of technologies they've brought in include a new growing system that increases the cropping density of their fruit, technology to support their energy sustainability, and they've also brought in new production lines. But I asked Chris about the skills required, and he says they haven't changed dramatically over time, but there is sort of gradual upskilling. So, for example, the line operators in the factories are dealing with more sophisticated equipment, so they have increased their skills. And Wilkin was able to use their own cash from long-term healthy trading for the investments in new technology, so they didn't have to take any loans, which I'm guessing is quite unusual. I think many SMEs say that funding for investment in new technology is an obstacle to innovation. Chris tells me that Wilkin Sons wouldn't automate if it had any impact on quality whatsoever, but that they will automate in order to stay efficient and to evolve. They do routinely engage their permanent staff in the company activities, but on their farm, they've only got a very small number of permanent staff, about 10, and a large seasonal workforce, about 300 or so. And so there, they are now exploring the use of robotics for picking, and that's not because they want to replace the seasonal workers. It's actually because they're finding it increasingly hard to be confident of getting those workers, and that's despite having a really good reputation for fair working conditions and a good rate of return of those seasonal workers, but they still can't be sure of getting enough. And Chris also tells me he has seen the kind of nature of the workforce changing in terms of their expectations. So they're family friendly, they're flexible where they possibly can be, which is relatively unusual in my experience of manufacturing, but the employees are increasingly expecting that. And then we did talk about this shift that I'm describing of people not working at one company their whole life and doing lots of different jobs for lots of different companies. And it's not something that Chris is seeing yet. And in fact, a few of you that I chatted to earlier said the same thing. You're not really seeing that shift. And I do wonder if employee-owned businesses will be amongst the last to feel the effect of this kind of short-term gig working. In fact, Wilkin Sons, they've got lots of long-term employees. When I spoke to Chris, he'd just given out a 60-year service award to someone, and they've got generations of the same families working in the business. And Chris, in fact, only has a mere 18 years of service, so he's a relative newcomer, I'm told. But I guess my lasting impression after talking to them, you know, here he is, the MD of a significant-sized business with all the usual pressures and challenges, was the extent to which he was integrating the employees into all of his business considerations. So I would like to think that it's that people-first DNA that is contributing to their long-term business success, and long may that continue. But the story of Wilkin Sons is consistent with research that's found that financial participation and ownership can support the successful adoption and integration of technology from both a leadership and an employee perspective. So perhaps it's not really surprising that some form of employee ownership is fairly common for tech startups who need to be changing and evolving. So, for example, the stock option scheme, EMI, is quite popular for tech startups in the UK. Now, I realise this slide is really hard to read from the back, but if you can even read the headlines, that would be good. Back at the Institute for the Future of Work, to help drive this thinking about positive outcomes of putting people first, we've created this Good Work Charter, which helps to kind of define the principles of what a good job looks like. And it may look like it is a really simple list of extremely obvious things, but it is surprising how powerful it can be if you deliberately check in with it every time you're thinking about making a change. So, for example, EU Robotics, which is a European body for robotics manufacturers, has adopted this charter. They've adapted it so that it's using terms and ideas that resonate within their industry, but it means whenever they develop new robotics, they're kind of actively checking a list to make sure they've thought about what that means for people. And in fact, some public bodies are using this, and they say, when they're thinking about legislation or some kind of change, they ask themselves, have we thought about the people? Have we considered this? And it's just quite a powerful way of checking in. So even if actually you only picked one point off this list, so let's say you take autonomy and you were bringing in automation, simply asking yourself, how does this automation impact the autonomy of our people? It's a simple, practical tool that makes sure whether you're an engineer, a business or a government, that you are actively thinking about people as you're making changes. So we are encouraging everyone to embrace the principles of this charter and adapt it to your own context to make sure that we're all considering not just work, but good work.
Could you read us those? Because it's quite hard to read.
All right, I will read them. So it goes, access, everyone should have access to good work. Number 2, fair pay, everyone should be fairly paid. You see what I mean? It's kind of obvious. Number 3, fair conditions, everyone should work on fair conditions set out on fair terms. Number 4, equality, everyone should be treated equally and without discrimination. Number 5, dignity, work should promote dignity. Number 6, autonomy, work should promote autonomy. Number 7, well-being, work should promote physical and mental well-being. Number 8, support, everyone should have access to institutions and people who can represent their interests. Number 9, participation, everyone should be able to take part in determining and improving working conditions. And number 10, learning. Everyone should have access to lifelong learning and career guidance. And although it's a really obvious list, what we found with the government bodies was that they were so used to kind of thinking about outputs, for example, in terms of care or something, that they realised that they were forgetting to really think about what does this mean for the people that are going to be delivering what we've just come up with. And the robotics people, the same thing. They realised that quite often the people buying robotics don't put into the requirement spec that they want the robotics to be nice to the people around them. But actually, of course they should be thinking about that. And so now they've got a checklist so that whether it's in the requirement spec or not, they are considering the impact their robot might have on the people around it. So it's kind of trivial, but actually it's good practice to just ask yourself, have we thought about what this means for the people? So I'm on to my summary. We need to put people first as a route to good work and driving a healthy future economy. And in the context of this lecture, that means that we need to invest in people and technology together, designing and applying technology in a way that will benefit everyone involved. This is back to my point that it's not an either or. This is about how we get the two things, people and technology, to work well together and be better for everyone. So I think we should make the approach of employee ownership an example of how we can do this better. I feel like it's part of your DNA. So the second point, we need to embed ethics and fairness with transparency about what we're doing within education, business, technology development and legislation to support a good and fair future of work. And then third, we need to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to learn new skills their whole life. And I do think that employee-owned companies have a reputation for performing better than others in areas of innovation, engagement, productivity, training, purpose, and fairness. So, the really good news is I'm convinced that employee-owned companies are already better equipped for this future of work than traditional companies. So to finish, I do have a request of you. I would like to see the employee ownership sector as an exemplar for managing technological changes in a way that puts people first. And as I said, I think that is in your DNA already. But there are two specific things that you could do that I think will help. First of all, I would encourage you to embrace new technology and automation as a route to improved productivity and ultimately better work. But Be the Business tells us that SMEs are generally not up to speed on technology, and Deb herself tells me that she thinks quite a lot of employee-owned businesses fall into that category, i.e. not fully up to speed on tech. It really is important to be across the technology for future sustainability of your business but also of the economy. So I would kind of urge you to embrace the tech challenge, not just for the sake of your business, but for the sake of the economy and even for society. And then secondly, to get ready for when you implement this new technology, I would ask you to embrace the idea of the Charter for Good Work and just adopt it to work for your business, but as a way of reminding you to keep checking in about people. And I would love to be able to say that the majority of employee-owned companies are aligned with these principles. That feels like a really easy ask. Frankly, I struggle to imagine that you wouldn't be. Please do send stories that you have of implementing technology and how. I know some of you have already volunteered to work with us, but do send us your stories, because we're embarking on a project with Warwick Business School to understand more about how we could affect a people-centred approach to introducing technology. And then we'll create some best practice guidelines. And I would like to think that employee-owned companies would be a good place to start in developing some of that best practice. So that's all I'm planning to say. Thank you for listening, and I'm open for questions, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. That's fantastic. I was going to open up with a question which I actually primed Naomi on, and I'm going to be really horrible now and change the question. Having listened to you, so the question I was going to ask was, as an opener, before you all ask your questions, was, did Naomi think that employer-owned businesses were well placed to take advantage of technology? But I think she's answered that already several times. So the question that I'm going to ask instead, you focus quite a lot on manufacturing, and actually 50% of the employee-owned sector is made up of businesses that are professional service companies, and many of those will be in the room today. So I guess my question would be, what would your view be of the impact of all of that on white-collar workers?
Yeah, so I do think that there's a significant impact on white-collar workers and professional services. Absolutely, and it is this hidden automation through data and monitoring that can replace an awful lot of tasks. And what's interesting is that if you're a professional services company, the opportunity to kind of do way more than you're currently doing is there. So I heard someone, it was a law professor, talking about law, where he was actually, law is very resistant to all of this tech. They think it's a bad idea. But he was saying what he says to his students are that as you study law, you could either, become a fantastic lawyer and maybe, if you're incredibly hardworking, you might affect the lives of 10,000 people during your career. Or you could study law and embrace AI and develop something that sort of democratizes legal support, and you could affect the lives of millions of people by applying that technology. So I think the kind of opportunity to just think differently about what might be possible if you brought in some of this tech and how it might allow you to do more. And this is back to my, if you're in professional services, you're not throwing people away to replace them with computers. It is kind of, what else could you do? What more could you do? How could you change your working model? So I certainly think that everyone has got elements of their job that will be taken over by a machine, but the sort of the mindset is, how fantastic, that means it must be kind of predictable work anyway. What else could I be doing with my brain if I'm not doing that? And so I think you'll miss out on a productivity opportunity and therefore a competitive advantage if you don't embrace this stuff and figure out something a little bit disruptive to do, and that more so than anywhere in the service business.
Okay, thank you. So it's your turn now. So can I have you raise your hand if you've got a question in the usual way? We need somebody to start. This gentleman down at the front. So somebody's going to bring you a microphone if that's okay, not least because we're recording today's lecture. So please do use the microphone when it's presented to you, and then we can make sure that your words are recorded. Everybody's watching Lisa now walk away. Do you want to say who you are and where you're from as well?
Can people hear me?
No.
Yeah, a lot of what you seem to be talking about is about eventually the control of work and control of work processes. And you mention those workers like Uber workers who've gone from being appendages of a machine to appendative AI, to people who work in banks, whose keystrokes are monitored, which seems a bit like the old-fashioned time and motion study. And I do think, with your summary, that a solution to the control of work and work processes can come from employer ownership. The thing is, at the moment, this country works longer hours than anywhere else in Europe. There's been a relative freeze on wages at the bottom end. You say the tech companies, rather like IBM in the past, are getting more and more of the results of work. And I wonder how you would democratize employer ownership to those areas of the economy which seem to be not just resistant to it, but actually are unable to hear because they have no ethical basis at all to them. And it's a moral value question. How can we work towards tools for conviviality as opposed to tools just for using people in the early Industrial Revolution sense as just making profits? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a deep question. Yeah, it's a great question. In fact, the time and motion. Oh, sorry. The time and motion. Is that working? It's flashing green and red. Have you got my backup mic working?
Don't set that one.
Oh, right then. Is that better? Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, the time and motion study was an analogy that I thought that's exactly what all of this monitoring stuff is doing. It's just trying to kind of make things more productive. And one of the things that we've been talking about a bit at the Institute is how important it is if a company is bringing in that sort of monitoring tech, that they really should be very clear with the employees about what it's for, because there have been quite a few examples of where they've brought it in and said, oh, it's for your well-being or whatever, which it may be partially, but then it turns out they're using it for all sorts of other slightly more sinister purposes. And so it is important that if you're going to bring that tech in, it should be clear what the purpose is. I do think in those situations, just engaging the employees in what would be helpful and what wouldn't, and understanding what that experience feels like would make an enormous difference. And if you look at the Amazon driver, if they'd have checked off the list of our charter, a few flags would have come up right away. You know, it's not rocket science. So that's kind of interesting. I have kind of reflected on how would I make Amazon employee owned, or Uber for that matter. You know, is that possible? And I don't, you know, in a way you're the experts on employee ownership, but I think for starters, the risk, in my mind, this is where my mind's gone and it's probably inaccurate, but the risk, let's say Amazon becomes employee owned, the risk would be that actually you'd still have, you know, maybe it would be a few thousand people sharing the benefits, but that you would still have all of these contract workers who weren't employees and so still didn't get the benefit. The kind of little shred of hope I would have that even in that situation, you assume then there is a kind of ethical basis of that core, that one would hope that they were then, even if they were using lots of contract workers or gig workers, that because there would be this kind of values-based ethical principles at the centre of the company, that maybe that would trickle through. So I don't know if that's a tad idealistic, but I can sort of see how that model might work. But actually with some of these huge platforms with lots and lots of freelance workers, it's problematic. I'm kind of interested on how that's going to work. So one of the things at the Institute we're hoping to get from you today, or not today, over the coming months, is we do think that employee-owned businesses are a pretty good place to start with discussing how this might work and trying to imagine what that might mean. How do we deal with lots of contract workers? How do we deal with a different type of workforce? I don't yet know the answers, but I think this is a great place to start the conversation.
Great. Can I
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we've got some more questions. Okay, gentleman there, then we'll come down to the front, and there's one over here, I think.
Me? Thank you very much for that. Two things really. I work for Oxfam, and some of the things that we're seeing in automation and in factories in places like Bangladesh have been offshored back to places like Germany as the factories become almost totally automated. So I think Adidas has recently moved production from Bangladesh to Germany. And so I wondered what your reflections are on the impact that it'll have in developing and emerging economies. secondly, the point you just made about platform, I think there's some really exciting examples of things like Worker, or driver run and owned equivalent of Uber, and it seems like there's a good opportunity for scale on that. And so I wondered if you could just explain a bit more about the technology which sits behind that, and if that's something that could be kind of expanded out, like those platforms, could they be open source, for instance, and could they be replicated in lots of different countries?
Okay, great questions. Thank you very much. So the onshoring and effectively taking jobs away, am I doing the wrong thing here?
You're not able to use the technology?
I'm not able to use technology. What are you doing? Are you press and hold or just press once? Does it need to be green?
There you go.
Okay, this is embarrassing.
Don't press the button.
I think this one works too. I'm an engineer. Damn. I'm just going to remind myself of the question. Yes. So onshoring from emerging countries and bringing work back. It does trouble me because one of the things I love about what tech's doing is that it's kind of democratizing. As I said, everyone on the planet has access to the world's knowledge, and you should be able to access work. The bad thing is if you're a gig worker in the UK, you are competing with people in much lower cost economies, and that's kind of frightening and hard. But I celebrate for those emerging economies who kind of desperately need a source of income too. So yes, I do kind of worry about the onshoring, but I still think because of these platforms having a reach around the globe, I think there still will be availability of high-skilled work. It will just pop up in slightly different ways. So I think that's a tide that you can't stop. That international working is going to be a norm, and that we will be competing worldwide for many things. So I think that will balance itself back out. And as I mentioned in our research, we're seeing that when you do onshore stuff, that doesn't bring work back to people. It generally means that you've just found the economy where you can invest in the tech, and so you're not bringing the work back for people, you're bringing the work back for machines. So that's, I'm not sure how that will pan out in the end. In terms of platforms, could they be open source? Yes, absolutely. The main problem with competing with an Amazon or an Uber or whatever is that they've got just this enormous scale, and that's why it's kind of hard to imagine how to topple them. I know you quite often hear people in European governments saying, why can't we have a European Amazon or Google or whatever? And it's just really hard to get up to the scale where you can offer the same level of service and the same kind of costs as these huge companies can. But as I said, companies can topple. And my instinct is that it will be kind of ethical things that do that. I think smaller companies that just have really good values will get enough critical mass of customer base to kind of grow and grow. I think that's the way it's going to happen, actually, that people will sort of almost boycott people with poor practices and with poor worker records and things. So I'm kind of optimistic about that, and yes, I think it can be open source. And there are a few examples of gig platforms in the UK that have been started by unions where they're really trying to sort of offer minimum wage and sort of be ethical and offer some degree of workers' rights. And so all of that is a kind of emerging area. But from a technology point of view, it's completely possible. What we want is the will of the people where they're willing to overlook the sort of just cheapness. So the Amazon example, actually, we've all got used to free delivery, and so we're part of the problem, actually, that we're driving down the deliverers' wages because we're outraged when we're expected to pay for someone to personally bring an item on a velvet cushion to us at our front door. Actually, why shouldn't we pay for that? So, collectively, society needs to demand some of this stuff, but I think that's going to happen. I'm seeing the beginnings of that now, so I'm optimistic.
Just on the platform initiatives, there is cooperative platforms which are now starting to emerge.
Yeah.
So utilising that technology, but the ownership sits in the hands of many of the individuals who are beneficiaries of the platform. So they're the gig workers, if you like, rather than it being a Google or another major US firm that's taking all the value. So, questions? More questions? So there's Nigel down here. Gentleman there. Who's over here? Can I just have a big show of hands? Can you put your hand right up, because it's really hard. So there's 2 people over here, so...
Hi, I have my name is Evelina from AHMM. My question was on legislation. You've mentioned earlier about starting with legislation that already exists and using that within the context of technology and AI. But is there maybe a scope for creating new legislation that actually enhances what's happening now?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a good question. So we are thinking that new legislation is probably needed, but we just felt that we should at least start by making sure we're applying what we've got, because you'd be surprised how somehow people don't think of applying the Equalities Act to data, and so we think there is scope to just improve what's happening at the moment simply by applying what we've already got. But yes, we think it is likely, for example, that the Equalities Act may need some brushing up in the context of this new world that we're all living in, and the right to know area would certainly require some new legislation. So it is something that we're talking to Parliament about, and we're getting a good deal of attention actually, and that's what our Equality Task Force is doing. I mean, there's although we've got the odd engineer in there, it's largely lawyers who are very motivated to look at this in this context and see what we can do. But I also think let's not lose sight of the fact that we've got a very decent Equality Act already, and we at the very least should be making sure that we're applying that.
Okay, we've got a question at the back, then we've got 2 down here. So I think, Sal, did you have a question?
James Sallows, Gripple, Load, Hog and Glide. As a manufacturing business, automation, innovation is absolutely key to our business, but just as much is the people element of it, which is all to us one and the same, and one is not at the expense of the other. How, as an employee ownership sector, could we push that approach to the mainstream?
Yeah, well, you tell me, really. I kind of feel like it's so obvious that what happens in employee-owned companies is good practice. And so it's sort of baffling to me that that isn't more widely used. And certainly it's unpublished research, but it is beginning to be obvious to us that companies where employee engagement is good do better and have happier employees and better results. And so it's one of those kind of why wouldn't everybody be doing this? So I don't know the answer to your question, but it's frustrating that it's not more mainstream, just what the business benefits are. But I go back to this emerging trend of even investors asking about sustainability, environment and all those other things. I think that's a really positive sign if both employees are pushing up from the bottom and investors are pushing down from the top, demanding a different kind of behaviour from companies. I think it will come out, but I just feel like employee-owned organisations have got an important role to play, because this is not new to you. And so just think you're in a better place to help shape what that looks like than a lot of traditional companies.
Okay, I think Nigel's had his hand up since the beginning.
That's fine, thank you. Superb talk, thank you very much. I'm very glad it's been recorded, because hopefully we can share it with colleagues. Bill Gates has suggested, I think seriously, that robots should be taxed on the grounds that labour is taxed. At the very least, you could say national insurance is a tax on jobs, but then income tax is a tax on labour as well. And he's saying that's not fair, and it's an inbuilt disadvantage to employed labour. It's a provocative comment. What do you think of that idea?
Yeah, the principle that all these people making obscene amounts of money should maybe pay some more tax, I think that has to be part of the solution. The trouble with a robot tax is, like I was saying, there's these obvious objects that are doing jobs. That's a robot, let's tax it. But so much of this is much more subtle, it's invisible, it is kind of just data behind the scenes that are automating things. So it's kind of really hard to kind of define that, and so it's a good headline, but it's quite hard to implement. The principle, though, that if we can't get people to play fairly and play nicely and share the benefits with the wider workforce, then tax has got to be one place to go. And there's a bunch of other things that I think that governments could do, as well as I don't know what the answer to the robot tax is, but there's something in that that feels. Sorry. Pay the workers more. Yeah, that would be a good start as well. But also, there are things that the government could do to incentivise financial participation. So they could, for example, find incentives to help SMEs who are trying to introduce new technology. They could introduce that. They could find incentives for financial participation type schemes, whether that's employee ownership or something short of that. I think there's a lot that the government could be doing that would help us to move in that direction. But there is something wrong with so few individuals making such huge sums of money that tax has got to be part of it.
And are you talking to government on a regular basis about those ideas, about what government could do to support and encourage more of that?
Yeah, we do quite a good job of getting into people's manifestos, don't we? So we attack it. We're across all. We're not political in that sense. We're across all parties, but we're constantly needling away at them. But I would defer, of course, to my co-chair, Sir Chris, who is much more equipped for talking to governments. I'm a bit of an industrialist, really. But no, as the Institute is well connected in government, and so we are on them on this one.
Okay. We've got two people here. We've got Graham and a gentleman behind him. There's two people at the front. Who else has got a hand up? Can I see? Okay, somebody at the back, and then we'll come down to the front. Is anybody over here? I'm just conscious that I'm not seeing everybody's hands. Oh, there's somebody at the back. Okay, we've probably got those 4 questions. Gentleman at the back, these 2, and this gentleman.
Thank you. Simon Burdess, John Lewis Partnership. I also thought it was an excellent presentation, so thank you. I was interested in your last comment about the advice that you're giving to government. It seems that we are at a sort of tipping point, society-wise, on the future of work. Does your work cover sort of risk scenarios about what happens if we don't get some of these key decisions right going forward for society?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm going to glance furtively at my chief executive. No. Actually, we did do some scenario planning, didn't we? When we first started the commission, we came up with a few scenarios for the future. It's a difficult one because the ultimate scenario is the kind of dystopian one. And in fact, I'm quite often struck by how you see these movies, which at the time seemed really ridiculous, and then there's a bunch of movies that came out where I'm suddenly thinking, wow, that was kind of, that they really had something there, where even Wall-E, that cartoon about, you've either seen it or you haven't, but the idea that we're sort of increasingly heading into a world where everybody's kind of just doing their own thing, working in a little virtual world, and society has broken down. You could get carried away, but I'm a chronic optimist if you haven't picked it out, but I absolutely can see a horrendous version of the future that I do not want to be part of. That said, the tipping point thing, I agree, the time is absolutely now. We really can make a positive difference to the way this all turns out. But I'm in a kind of never give up mentality. So if we do nothing for another 5 years, it will just become more apparent that we need to do something. It'll never be too late, but it would just be a whole lot easier if we cracked off on this journey right away. So I think at some point it will just become so obvious that something's gone horribly wrong that we will all be motivated to do it. But actually, government's pretty receptive. I think government has also seen all those horror movies, and they all understand how bad it could be if we get it wrong. The inequality thing is the one that bugs me the most. I do think there's something quite badly wrong there, that employee ownership fixes overnight. So it would be really nice to find a way to make that shift quickly.
Okay, should we just move to Graham, then the gentleman behind me?
Thank you. I don't have a question. I've actually got a request and a thank you. Graham Nuttall, Field Fisher, and as you said, I am a trustee of the Institute for the Future of Work, so I do have a vested interest. Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. The request is to ask for examples from the employee-owned sector, particularly in areas such as care, home care. It's not something you had time to touch on in your talk, but I do see employee ownership perhaps being the only answer to delivering, for example, care for the aged in a compassionate and profitable way for all involved, and that perhaps privately run, typically capitalist-owned organisations will not be able to deliver technological change in a people-centred way. So I particularly encourage sort of home care companies in the EO sector to send in examples to IFOW. And the thank you is to thank you for using Wilkin Sons as an example. There is a splendid connection with Robert Oakeshott. Wilkin Sons is one of those few examples we have of companies where Robert was personally involved. And indeed, Peter Wilkin from the Wilkin family is in the audience today and was managing director at the time. He took that brave decision to embark on employee ownership at a time when few did. And Robert was part of that, that decision-making process. He remembers Robert arriving at the farm, dressed in his sort of shabby raincoat. In fact, he observed Robert seemed to wear this raincoat whether it was raining or not, and whether it was winter or not. So this is a splendid connection to Robert, and given this is the Robert Oakeshott Memorial Lecture. So thank you very much for using
Thanks,
that
Graham.
example.
I think actually Peter's behind you.
Yeah.
So the gentleman behind you has got a question. Is that Chris? Yes.
Hi, Naomi. Thank you very much. That was a fantastic lecture. Chris Newnham from Wilkin Sons, and thank you for the shameless branding as well. We appreciate that. My question, I'm afraid, is a much more base question. With my other hat on, I am a parent of 3 teenage children, all Generation Zers, who have an absolutely fatal addiction to their technology. Should we be celebrating their engagement with technology and their thirst for knowledge, or actually are we looking at a looming mental health crisis somewhere down the road?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the jury's out on that. Well, I mean, lately, most of the articles seem to be saying they've decided it's not harmful after all, and I kind of reflect back to my teenage years when my mother was always on at me because I spent, 8-10 hours a day reading a book, and she was always snarling at me to go out and be sociable, and so I kind of reflect on what's the difference. At least quite a lot of the online activity is notionally sociable. And so one of the theories I've heard, which I quite like, is that there will be a bit of a pendulum swing, that we've all got a bit extreme. I am embarrassingly addicted to my phone, certainly, and you see a parent out with a child in a stroller, sort of, reading their phone as they're going, and the child kind of looking for eye contact and not getting it. And the theory is that that generation growing up with that will actually have a much healthier relationship with their tech than we do, because it's new to us, so we're kind of playing with it. But that actually there's a chance that it will swing back to something a little bit more sensible. So I'm clinging to that, partly because I'm an optimist rather than because there's any real evidence. But the latest studies, because there was a wave of studies that were saying it was terrible for mental health, but it's the same story, that there are a lot of tech ways of supporting mental health. So I encountered various companies that are researching, how actually a mobile phone could send out mental health flags, that actually it notices that you're walking much slower than usual, or it notices changes in your patterns of behavior and is actually flagging that in helpful ways. So there's kind of the theory at the moment, the current thinking is that it's not as bad as we all think it is, and I'm wrestling with the idea that maybe it's just a generational thing, and that in reality this is just progress. Bill Gates, who was referenced earlier, is kind of saying that when we're in a doom and gloom moment, we should realise just how much tech has done for us, that actually, the death rates of under 5s globally is just plummeted, and our lifespans overall globally have shot up, and more of the world now are living in middle-income countries, which 15 years ago was absolutely not the case. That technology has delivered the most incredible societal benefits, and Bill Gates argues that if you're born today, you're in a much better position than if you were born 20 years ago. And actually, he reckons if you're born in 20 years' time, you'll be in an even better position. And it's kind of hard to keep sight of that. I have days where it all just seems like it's going down the pan. But actually, I think that's right. If you step back and look at the big picture, how incredible is it that everybody on the planet could access the world's knowledge? I think that's pretty amazing.
Okay, we'll just... No question. Okay, I think Unless there's any... there's one burning question in the middle. Let's have the burning question in the middle. I'm always keen that everybody gets the chance to answer the question if we can. One gentleman just down front here, Lisa. Lisa's only doing this because her Fitbit told her she hadn't walked enough steps this morning.
Hi, my name is Mark from Troika Consulting. We spend a lot of time kind of looking forward kind of at the future, and I'm just kind of mindful that this is the fourth industrial revolution. So looking back at the previous three, what lessons have we tried to learn from those that we can apply to the fourth one, which will help us kind of get a better balance between the rush to implement this technology and particularly the ethical question?
That's a fantastic question. The radical idea that we should maybe learn something from the past. So I have two thoughts about the past. One is, actually, if you go pre-industrial revolution, there was a time when people just did the minimum amount of work they could do to live. And life was not about work. You didn't identify yourself by what you did. You simply did the minimum that you could do in order to have enough to eat, and then you cracked on and lived. And then come the Industrial Revolution, the Victorians kind of instilled a sense of, 9 to 5, you go to work, there's a work ethic, and people started to identify themselves by their jobs, and they were proud of their work and all that stuff. And so there's a kind of piece of me that's thinking, well, if there aren't enough jobs to go around, maybe we need to reinvent getting satisfaction out of other things in life. And actually, whether you're staying at home bringing up children or caring for someone else or doing something charitable or just creating fantastic art, you're contributing positively to society. Maybe we should be seeing that as work too. Maybe we should be getting our sense of purpose and identity from that. So it's interesting from the past that there has been a time when people didn't need work in order to have a sense of purpose and value, and I wonder if that is a possibility for the future. The other thing from industrial revolutions typically is that although the past has taught us that generally when you have an industrial revolution, lots of jobs are displaced and guess what, new ones pop up. If you sort of zoom in a bit on that, there is actually a kind of 10 or 20 years when it's pretty grim and people who have lost their jobs are not the ones that are getting the new work. And so the learning we're trying to apply from that is we're trying to shortcut that. We're trying to say, well, let's try and look after those people that would otherwise just go into a slump for a decade or two. Let's try and get some of the skilling and the lifelong learning going now so that people don't have to go through that dreadful time. Otherwise, it's, even though it worked out all right in the end on the past ones, there was a pretty grim period. And that's what we do want to learn from that, and that's what we're trying to avoid this time.
Okay, sadly, I'm getting the time up at the back. Sadly, that's the end of the time we've got allocated for questions. I think Naomi and Anna are staying with us for drinks afterwards. So that was amazing. Fantastic lecture and amazing answering of questions. I think we got as much from the question and answer session as probably from the lecture itself. So please do join me in the usual way to say thank you.
Thank you.
So we got a lot from that. I've got mountains of notes. But as somebody just reminded me, this has been recorded on Periscope, which is a technology that's associated with Twitter. So some people have been watching online, but it will be on Twitter for another 24 hours. And then I think we'll be taking it off Twitter and hosting it on our website. So you will be able to share it with other people. But we got a definition of what the difference between automation and AI is. We heard that this fourth industrial revolution is even affecting cows. Who knew? Cows' ears are connected to the internet. We also heard about the new forms of work that are being delivered through online platforms and the portfolio employment that many workers are now the subject of. I thought it was really interesting about the who benefits piece. Is it shareholders, is it investors, or is it the workers themselves? Naomi also pointed out the challenges, and I think the fact of 65% of primary school children starting school this year will be doing jobs that don't exist today. That's quite phenomenal, because if you're a primary school child, that's what you're 5, and you might start working 15 years. So in 15 years' time, 65% of the jobs we won't have even conceived. That's quite amazing. I think one of the big takeouts for me, Robert mentioned this, Naomi talked about it, is the need for lifelong learning. So the training commitment by individuals and by the businesses that employ them will be phenomenal in this new world where technology continues to evolve and change. And hopefully all of your businesses are well placed anyway to think about that. We didn't really get into the ethics, and there is a big ethical dimension here. I was at a conference in October where we were talking about AI and ethics and the biases that are built into some of the algorithms, which is quite, the unintended consequences, I think, is quite a dangerous area, and certainly should appear on yours and Anna's risk register. So I'd just like to, again, thank Naomi, remind you all, she asked a few things. Look at that Good Work Charter, see if it's something that your business can sign up to. Graham just reminded us as well, if any of you feel that you'd like to share your story of how you've implemented technology and what has been the impact and effect, then I'm sure Anna and Naomi would be delighted to have your case studies. I do feel that we've sort of uncovered a topic which we could probably do some collaboration together on, so I'm going to put that down as an action for me. And I think you should all think about what you're going to do differently when you get back to the office, because this should hopefully have started you thinking about how are we dealing with some of these issues, and are we really open and embracing technology. So, it's the end of the lecture. Again, thank you all for being here. Thank you to Robert and his team for sponsoring the lecture. We have, I think, about half an hour outside for some more refreshments and to linger a little while and have some more conversations. We've got EO Day coming up shortly. I think you're all familiar with this annual celebration of employee ownership, and indeed the technology delivers. That wasn't voice activated, by the way. That's Anne being very on it and pressing the button at the right time. So EO Day is at the end of June. You'll be getting packs soon and information next month about what we're going to be doing to celebrate. Please do make sure that you're planning for that. And lastly, another plug for Robert's book. Don't forget that's out there. So I hope you've really enjoyed our first event of 2020. There's lots more to come during the year. Thank you for attending, and we'll see you again soon.